I'm Jenna Arxler, and I'm the Vice President of the Economics Club here. Our speaker is a partner with the distinguished Sioux Falls law firm Davenport, Evans, Hurwitz, and Smith. For the past 30 years, he has had an active practice in corporate law, public finance, and in working with banks in all aspects of regulation, management, and lending. He also served as a contract lobbyist during 10 sessions of the South Dakota legislature, working extensively in trust company, banking, and insurance legislation. Before law school, our speaker had a 10-year career in banking, first as a commercial lender with U.S. Bank in Rapid City, then in Minneapolis, managing U.S. Bank's system-wide commercial loan participation pool, and finally, managing Western Bank's mortgage banking operation in Sioux Falls. It was during this time that he had an up-close look at the events that unexpectedly led to Citibank's decision in 1980 to move its credit card business to South Dakota. Doug Hajek has a keen interest in the history of banking in South Dakota, especially the developments that gave birth to South Dakota's reputation as a center for financial institutions that do business on a nationwide basis. He is going to share an important part of that history with you tonight. Let's welcome Doug Hajek.
Thank you, Jenna. Thank you, Jenna. It is a pleasure indeed to be here at Augustana. I want to thank the Augustana Economics Club for inviting me to speak about this remarkable moment in South Dakota's history, one that continues to impact our state and its people in so many ways. The poster for this event features the photos of 10 people. Two of the more famous images are of United States Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall and Judge Robert H. Bork. Maybe the first time in history their images have appeared on the same sheet of paper. You may have wondered what Justice Marshall and Judge Bork would have had to do with the credit card business, but after tonight you'll know. As we begin our discussion, I'd like you to consider the words of an Austrian-born economist and a Nobel laureate whose last name, coincidentally, is similar to mine. In his book, The Fatal Conceit, Friedrich Hayek wrote, "The curious task of economics is to demonstrate to men how little they really know about what they imagine they can design." Think about Hayek's quote as we trace the history of our state suddenly finding itself on the national stage. Here's a question to consider. In 1980, could anyone have conceived of a plan that would bring Citibank here? In my opinion, the answer is no. Even if possible to design, such a plan would have been well beyond the edges of credibility and quite simply too audacious to be taken seriously.
Where the credit card business South Dakota had very tight historical laws on what you could charge to borrow. In other words, there was one interest rate by law that they could charge for new cars, another one for used cars. It was highly regulated what interest rates people could pay. What I'm trying to say is, we may have a law that says you can charge 9%, but money costs 11%, so banks weren't loaning money.
To get the banks to issue loans, South Dakota decided to eliminate its historic cap on the interest rates, known as a usury law.
We had actually changed some of our laws in '79, and we had previously introduced legislation, passed legislation, or passing legislation, to lift the ceilings on usury so we could free up and get capital in South Dakota.
At the same time, across the country in New York City, a legendary banker had his own problems.
Well, it's very simple. We were going broke.
Volcker Solution, then chairman of Citibank, had a credit card division that was hemorrhaging money. New York's usury laws prohibited banks from charging more than 12% on most consumer loans.
Interest rates went up to 20%. And if you are lending money at 12% and paying 20%, you don't have to be Einstein to realize you're out of business.
Some of you may recognize that clip from the August 2004 documentary, The Secret History of the Credit Card. Unfortunately, the program itself was a little short on history and really didn't reveal any secrets. But I do agree South Dakota was an unlikely place to begin the modern history of the credit card. And it's also unlikely that South Dakota would, as it does today, lead the nation in banking assets, and that Citibank and Wells Fargo, two of the four largest financial institutions in the United States, would designate Sioux Falls as their main office. The convergence of several historic events produced what looked like a fluke, the odds of which, in my estimation, would have been only slightly above zero. It's a common perception that it all happened in South Dakota because South Dakota repealed its usury law to lure Citibank here, a perception created by reports like this from the New York Times. The story began in the winter of 1980 when Citibank, frustrated with New York's usury law, looked afield for a friendlier state. At Citibank's urging, South Dakota promptly stepped forward, eliminating its usury ceiling and winning the bank's credit card operations. Sound right? Well, it's not even close to what happened. Citibank had nothing to do with the change in South Dakota's usury law. I'll get to how it happened, but first I'd like to start with why it happened. There were many influences, but there are two underlying forces that stand out. First, Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker's tight money policy, and second, a United States Supreme Court decision involving a dispute between two banks, one from Minneapolis, the other from Omaha, both major credit card issuers at the time. I graduated from South Dakota State University in 1972. Right afterward, I began a 10-year career in banking. I was brought up on the commercial lending side of the business, but I was well aware of the federal consumer credit regulations that by today's standards were pretty modest. On the deposit side, we didn't worry much about rates because Regulation Q set the maximum and every bank paid it, which for bank savings accounts was 4% at the time, and for savings institutions, 0.25% more. As the graph shows, by 1979, inflation had been entrenched for nearly a decade, and there have been several high-profile efforts to uproot it. In August 1971, President Richard Nixon used his presidential authority to impose wage price controls. He was afraid that if he didn't do something, the Fed would impose tight money, which would lead to a recession in 1972, the year he would be up for re-election. As you can see from the graph, the controls worked for a while, and indeed Nixon was re-elected. When the controls came off in April of 1974, prices quickly shot up, even faster than before. Nixon resigned in August 1974 with Vice President Gerald Ford succeeding to the presidency. You may recall that Nixon's original vice president, Spiro Agnew, had previously resigned in the midst of a corruption scandal. After he had been president for 2 months, in October, President Ford announced a great fanfare his Whip Inflation Now campaign. It included several measures to control costs, among them more food production, less energy consumption, and a requirement that all legislation be evaluated for its inflation impact. We dutifully wore our wind pins around the bank for about a week or so until it seemed rather pointless. Wind was a nice thought, but it didn't work, at least for not in any lasting way. 1979 had its memorable moments. Margaret Thatcher became the first woman to serve as Britain's prime minister. The Shah of Iran was overthrown. The Ayatollah Khomeini returned after 15 years in exile to become Iran's supreme leader. Magic Johnson's Michigan State Spartans defeated Larry Bird's Indiana State Sycamores to win the NCAA basketball championship. And the Village People rocketed to fame with the release of their one and only but enduringly popular hit, YMCA. More pertinent to tonight's discussion, though, was President Jimmy Carter's decision to make Paul Volcker chairman of the Federal Reserve in August of 1979. Until then, the Fed's traditional approach in carrying out monetary policy was to manipulate interest rates, particularly the Fed funds rate, which is the rate that banks charge each other for overnight loans. With inflation in the double digits and under an approach that was utterly failing the Fed's statutory mandate to maintain price stability, Volcker decided a dramatic change was in order. He wanted to more directly control the money supply by focusing on non-borrowed bank reserves and the discount rate, thereby leaving the Fed funds rate to float. The Reserve Board's decision to adopt this new procedure occurred at a secret, hastily called special meeting on Saturday, October 6th. Wall Street traders called it Volcker's Saturday Night Special. So, and float the rates did. Take a look at the table. Interest rates went to unbelievably high levels. By December, the Fed funds rate and the prime rate had jumped to over 20%. Nationwide mortgage rates were in the range of 15%. To illustrate in dollar terms what this means, consider the fact that last year, the average price of a home sold in Sioux Falls was $190,000. If you paid 10% down and financed the rest over 30 years at today's rate of about 4%, the monthly principal and interest payment would be $816. At 15%, the payments on the same home would be $2,162. That's $1,346 more every month. At these rates, the home construction business was in a deep coma. In this environment, Regulation Q, rather than protecting banks by limiting the interest that they could pay, was rapidly draining them of their deposits, and their customers found other places to get better returns on their money. The easing of Reg Q's limits in 1980 stemmed the tide of deposit withdrawals, but it also led to much higher interest costs, and before long, banks were paying out more interest on deposits than they were earning on loans. Where usury applied, every new loan was a money loser for the bank, so naturally borrowing became very difficult, especially for farmers and small business. These were the conditions when the Legislative Committee of the South Dakota Bankers Association met in November of 1979 to discuss its priorities for the 1980 legislative session. I had just joined Western Bank in August of that year, 3 months earlier, so I was pleasantly surprised when my bosses, T.M. Reardon and T.J. Reardon, invited me to attend that meeting with them in Pierre. I had no clue that TM was planning to present a radical proposal. We gathered for a morning meeting in a conference room at the King's Inn, which in those days doubled as Pierre's second capital. For those of you who are only familiar with today's King's Inn, I should mention that it bears no resemblance to the King's Inn in 1980. There were about 30 of us in attendance. As the most important issue, usury was first on the agenda. Bankers were conflicted over how to deal with this issue because only the year before they had gotten the legislature to increase the usury limit from 10% to 12%. They didn't want to appear greedy. Mr. Reardon listened patiently for about a half hour. Seeing that the discussion was going nowhere, he moved that the association propose to the legislature a permanent solution, one that would exempt regulated lenders from the state's usury limits. The motion was seconded without delay by a gentleman sitting right across the table from him, TM's brother-in-law, Chuck Burke, who was also a peer banker and a member of the South Dakota Banking Commission. With little discussion and no dissent, that resolution passed. And while I witnessed it, it wasn't until about 20 years later that I realized, when TM gave me a copy of his memoirs, that he had gotten Mr. Burke's promise ahead of time to second his motion. He was concerned that with a motion like that, it could easily die for a lack of a second, and he didn't want to leave that to chance. So the usury bill was introduced into the 1980 legislature on January 8th, the very first legislative day. At the committee hearing, when public testimony was taken, before it went to the House floor, four bankers, 2 lobbyists, and the chief investment officer of the South Dakota Investment Council all testified in favor of the bill. Not a single person testified as an opponent. It passed the House on January 22nd on a vote of 59-8. Then on February 2nd, which was the 22nd day of the 30-day legislative session, it passed the Senate on a vote of 30-0. Having passed both houses, the bill only needed the governor's signature to become law. While this was happening, New York's usury limit was causing huge losses in Citibank's credit card operation. Walter Wriston, its legendary chairman, who was shown in the video clip, was desperate to find a solution. Citibank had already lost $1 billion in the credit card business, and the bank's future was even more troubling to contemplate. But Wriston could not convince New York Governor Hugh Carey to support easing the state's usury restrictions. Governor Carey, a friend of Wriston's, was sympathetic. He just did not see any chance that he would be able to get the legislature to go along with an easing of the state's usury law. A United States Supreme Court decision the previous year gave Citibank options. Marquette Bank, the Minneapolis bank owned by Carl Pohlad, was a successful credit card issuer, but found that it was losing business to the First National Bank of Omaha. With Minnesota's usury limit of 12%, Marquette charged an annual fee. Nebraska's limit was 18%, so it could offer a credit card without charging an annual fee. When First National Bank of Omaha started offering cards to Minnesota residents in Minnesota at 18% with no annual fee, Marquette Bank sued. By the time the case made it to the United States Supreme Court, First National Bank of Omaha was represented by Robert Bork. Bork had previously served as the U.S. Solicitor General, and as such, he had appeared in front of the Supreme Court on many occasions, until he resigned in 1977, the year before the Marquette decision. Bork is an interesting character in history, so I'd like to take a minute to talk about him. While Solicitor General in 1973, Bork had the misfortune of finding himself a central character in the Saturday Night Massacre, one of the lowlights of the Watergate affair. And yes, this is the very same Bork who, in 1982, was appointed to the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals and was nominated for a seat on the Supreme Court by Ronald Reagan in 1987. Bork was conservative, but was nominated for a seat being vacated by Justice Lewis Powell, a moderate and often a swing vote. Bork would clearly have changed the balance on the court So Democrats, with Senator Ted Kennedy leading the way, immediately went on the offensive. The photo shows Mr. Bork in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee in 1987, shortly before it rejected his nomination. Journalist William Safire said he was borked, a term that's still used today. So his role in the Marquette case came between the Saturday Night Massacre and getting borked by the Senate Judiciary Committee. Okay, back to the Marquette decision. Remember now, the year is 1978. To give you a little flavor of the case, here is a portion of the exchange during the oral argument. Marquette Bank's lawyer: all I can say is Marquette Bank has been disadvantaged. The statute was passed both for the benefit of banks in Minnesota and for Minnesota consumers. We are injured when the Nebraska bank comes in here and offers its card free to Minnesota residents. It can afford to offer its card free when it's permitted to charge an 18% rate. If it had operated at a 12% rate, they wouldn't be offering that card. Justice Thurgood Marshall was clearly not impressed with the Minnesota bank's case. He responded this way: now, I should say one word about this enormous competitive disadvantage which Marquette Bank thinks it lives under. And that competitive disadvantage turns out to be entirely that the Omaha Bank can advertise a free credit card. Well, Marquette Bank could have advertised a 33% lower interest rate. This entire case, this entire attempt to change the structure of the national banking system turns out to be a fight over alternative advertising techniques. And then this zinger from Justice Marshall: I really think the Marquette Bank would have done better to take their case to an advertising agency than to a law firm. The court ruled in favor of Bork's client, First National Bank of Omaha. The court held in a unanimous decision that under the National Bank Act, the laws of the card issuer state of domicile determine the maximum rate, not the laws of the state where the cardholder lived. Well, there probably weren't two people in South Dakota who gave a hoot about the Marquette Bank case at the time, but it turned out to be one of the most important cases from the Supreme Court in our state's history. Citibank, on the other hand, did care. Because of the Marquette decision, it knew that the usury law in one state could be exported throughout the United States. Yet, Citibank's parent company also knew, because of the Douglas Amendment to the Bank Holding Company Act of 1956, that as an out-of-state bank holding company, it could not come to a state without an invitation from the state's legislature. In other words, the Marquette decision and favorable usury laws would do Citibank no good without an invitation. Here's another thing that Citibank knew. No state legislature had ever approved such an invitation. Yet, as it was losing $300,000 a day, it became clear in January 1980 that Citibank could expect no relief from New York and would have to move. Now it faced two questions. First, was there a state that had more favorable usury laws? Second, if so, would it be possible on relatively short order to get an invitation from one of those states? As to the first question, Citibank's legal department, being unaware that South Dakota's legislature was in the process of passing its usury exemption, determined on the basis of existing statutes that 5 states deserved a further look: Rhode Island, Nevada, Hawaii, Missouri, and South Dakota. As to the second question, getting an invitation, Rhode Island and Nevada were crossed off because their legislatures were not in session. Hawaii was eliminated because it would have been a logistical nightmare to operate a credit card business there, even if they did invite Citibank. That left Missouri, which had a 22% interest rate, or usury limit, I should say, and South Dakota, whose rate ceiling Citibank believed to be 24% based upon its reading of our existing statutes. Both states had the additional advantage of being centrally located, an important consideration since Citibank's cardholders were spread all over the U.S. Citibank Vice Chairman Charlie E. Long, the head of Citibank's national and international consumer banking business, preferred Missouri because he had previously been an executive with TWA for 9 years and had many contacts with business and government. He had none in South Dakota, so Citibank scrambled internally to find someone who could help them make contact with our governor. Now, in the second week of February, it had grown to an urgent matter because there were only a few days left in South Dakota's 30-day session. So, in 1980, how does a New York bank connect or get connected with the governor of a faraway land like South Dakota? It's one of those only in South Dakota stories that I first learned from Governor Janklow's legal counsel and close advisor, Harry Christensen. The details of this story were confirmed by two lawyers, Karen Crew, the widow and longtime partner of the person involved, law partner, Margaret Crew, that person's sister, and Ron Williamson, the governor's chief of staff at the time. Here it is. A lawyer at Citibank, an Aberdeen native and a Harvard Law graduate, came up with the name of Michael Crew, a Harvard Law alum who was practicing in Vermillion at the time. He immediately called Mike, and Mike immediately called the governor's office. The assistant who took Mike's call wanted him to speak to Ron Williamson, but Ron was away from his office at the time, so Mike Crew left a message. When Ron didn't return his call by the next morning, Mike Crew asked his sister Margaret, then a lawyer with the South Dakota Attorney General's office, to pay a personal visit on Ron to give him more details. Margaret told Ron of the urgency of the matter. Citibank wanted to talk to the governor, and it could mean jobs. Coinciding with this came a call from Governor Farrar, who was at a banking conference in Hawaii, when a St. Paul banker he knew got a message to him. Governor Farrar immediately called Ron and told him that it was urgent to talk to Janklow because he had just heard Citibank was interested in coming to South Dakota. After conferring with Governor Janklow, Ron called Mike Crew, and the meeting was arranged. Margaret observed, in the experience of their environment, it probably wouldn't have occurred to a New Yorker that if you want to talk to the governor of South Dakota, you could just call him. So, on February 14th, now the 28th legislative day, and only 2 days left in the legislative session, Charlie Long met in the governor's office with Governor Janklow. Charlie had never been to South Dakota. He didn't know anyone from South Dakota, and he didn't know anything about South Dakota. I figured that made he and Governor Janklow about even because Janklow said until that week he had never heard of Citibank. The governor assumed Charlie was there because of the just passed usury legislation. But Charlie said that wasn't the purpose of his visit. He said Citibank had no mechanism to track state legislation while it was happening, so he didn't even know about South Dakota's usury bill. Now Janklow was really puzzled. Why was it so urgent for them to talk? Charlie explained that Citibank needed to move to a new state, but because of the Douglas Amendment, it could not come without an invitation from the legislature. He was there to see if South Dakota would invite Citibank. Charlie went through it all again at a luncheon meeting at the King's Inn. The governor, the state's Secretary of Commerce, Helen Wagner, and the majority and minority leaders of both houses were all present. That meeting ended, and Janklow had to figure out what to do. He was as eager to find new jobs as Citibank was to find a solution to its problem. But still, this was unlike anything he had ever dealt with. With this Citibank thing seemingly falling from the sky, he needed someone to talk to. He had to determine what kind of commitment to extract from Citibank and was worried that he would ask for too little. More urgently, he had to figure this out. With only 2 legislative days left, how could he get the legislature to do something that no state legislature had ever done, and that is to invite an out-of-state holding company to establish a bank in our state? Governor Janklow called on Jeremiah Murphy, a lawyer and lobbyist from Sioux Falls, a trusted confidant and close friend. Jeremiah knew state government inside and out, and he knew all of the key players. Jeremiah told the governor with such a short time in the session that unless the governor had the support of South Dakota's bankers, there was no way he could get this done. Jeremiah's unique skills in persuasion were legendary and critical, not just in dealing with legislators, but for the moment, more importantly, dealing with the independent bankers and the regional banks and helping them to understand why supporting the invitation was in their interest. The 29th legislative day passed, and there was a 25-day break before the final day. During this interim, the governor and Jeremiah prepared the groundwork with legislators and bankers. Charlie went back to Missouri, the state he favored. Charlie said he wanted to go to Kansas City and did not want to go to Sioux Falls because Kansas City had computer rooms, programmers, good communication system, good labor pool, and so on. Sioux Falls was an unknown. But after spending a few days there, talking to the governor's chief of staff, the mayors of Kansas City and St. Louis, the leaders of Missouri's legislature, and the Bankers Association, Charlie could see that Missouri would be a challenge. With over 700 banks in Missouri and downright hostility among some of them, it would be extremely difficult to convince them that they should support an invitation, well, frankly, to even just not oppose it, much less to support it. So, as planned, Charlie came back to South Dakota on March 3rd. The governor made it clear to Charlie that he, Janklow, was not going to do all of the work. Charlie agreed to meet with the bankers, first in Sioux Falls, at the lounge on the top of the Holiday Inn, and after that in Pierre, in the appropriations room of the Capitol building. In his biography of Riston, Philip Zweig wrote that going into the critical peer meeting, Janklow had this little pep talk for Charlie. "You're coming out here with a Brooklyn accent. We don't like slick guys from Wall Street out here. We've all seen The Music Man many times, and we're not buying trombones from strangers. You've got work to do." Going in, several influential bankers were very vocal about their doubts, with concerns that Citibank would go after their customers. For his part, Janklow emphasized all the benefits that this could mean for South Dakota. Yet he told the bankers that they could stop it if they wanted to. Charlie, who was accompanied by Citibank's general counsel, Patrick Mulhern, leveled with the bankers and told them Citibank would accept whatever restrictions they decided to impose. Yet he also told them that if Missouri extended an invitation, Citibank would go to Missouri. There was great value in Charlie's candor because it added to the credibility of his statement that he didn't think Missouri could get it done. The following recollections of Governor Janklow will give you a sense of what it was like on that day with those bankers. Here in Janklow's words. When the Q&A session was over, Bill Doherty, the former lieutenant governor and one of the founders of Sun Bank, Sioux Falls, says, "I tell you what, I'm the littlest bank in Sioux Falls, and I don't fear these guys at all. I just think this is a hell of an opportunity for South Dakota. I don't know how you've been able to do this, Janklow, but I'll do anything I can to help you." And the next thing I know, Harold Tornes from the Sisseton Bank says, "You know, I don't owe anything to Sioux Falls, but I don't see this is going to hurt us rural banks either. I say if it's good for Sioux Falls, then it's good for my town of Sisseton, and I'm for it. The next guy, Chuck Seaman, speaks up and he said, I'm from Warner. I'll never forget those 3 in a row. I didn't even know where the hell Warner was at the time. He said, I'm from the Warner Bank, and I'll tell you, it isn't ever going to help us, except that it's good for South Dakota, and I'll support it. Anyhow, we went around the room. It was like everybody coming to the rail at a revival, one after the next, signing up for Jesus. The next thing I know, they got around to President Glenn Waltner of Freeman, and he said, well, when you left the room, Governor, we were going to hold a secret meeting and vote on it. But it sounds like everybody but me's voted, and you can count me in. Moments later, the Executive Committee of the Bankers Association passed a resolution supporting the bill to invite Citibank. Later, Charlie Long expressed how radically different the South Dakota bankers had been compared to what he encountered in Missouri. His meeting with the bankers in Missouri was very unpleasant. They beat him up. In South Dakota, he saw everybody in the same room together, and on the spot, he was able to address their concerns. Of all the things the governor needed to do, getting the banks to support the invitation on such short order was probably his most remarkable achievement. But it was also quite a statement about the progressive attitude of South Dakota's bankers, from the largest to the smallest, that they would all be willing to set their parochial interests aside to accomplish something much bigger for our state. We owe a lot of credit to the bankers I mentioned earlier, and others, for being willing to stand up in front of their colleagues and strongly express their support. Things would have turned out much differently if they hadn't. Governor Janklow was able to get Citibank to commit to hiring a minimum of 300 to 500 South Dakota workers, but understood that there was a potential for significantly more if the Federal Reserve would approve moving the entire credit card operation to South Dakota. This commitment wasn't in writing, though. It was done on a handshake. Work continued on the bill to invite Citibank to make sure it contained all the limitations the bankers had requested. On the very last legislative day, a day normally reserved for dealing with vetoed bills, the legislature suspended its rules, allowing the bill to be introduced and acted upon without the usual public hearings and without the usual second reading. And so House Bill 1370 was introduced, passed by the Senate 33-1, and the House 64-2, and signed by the governor, all in time for an early lunch on March 12th, the last day of the 1980 legislative session. With an emergency clause, it went into effect immediately. Although the bill was referred to as the Citibank Bill, the authorization was not limited to Citibank. It also allowed other out-of-state holding companies to come here as long as they satisfied 3 requirements. First, the holding company could establish only one bank in South Dakota. Second, it must have capital of at least $25 million. And third, the bank must operate out of a single office at a location that is not likely to attract customers from the general public. To anyone who didn't know what was going on, this might seem like a pretty odd invitation, but these conditions were not a problem for Citibank. One office was fine. It ultimately invested $250 million in capital, and it wasn't interested in competing with South Dakota banks. It wouldn't be quite accurate to say it was smooth sailing after that. Citibank still had its own regulatory approvals to obtain, which involved, among other things, a hearing in front of the South Dakota Banking Commission and OCC hearings in Sioux Falls, and another one, especially contentious one, in New York. In addition, certain members of Citibank's board were not thrilled with the idea of moving this massive operation and many jobs to South Dakota in the midst of a national recession. They were taking a lot of heat from the public and the New York media, all serving as further testament to Governor Janklow's masterful job in holding this incredibly complex deal together and getting it to the finish line. The New York Times seemed shocked that Citibank would actually go through with this. Here's what the Times reported on June 29th, 1980. It sounded like saber rattling, but Citibank really means it. They've signed a one-year lease for 3 floors in the Western Bank building in downtown Sioux Falls that will serve as a temporary base of operation, and is negotiating the purchase of 10 acres where it plans to build its permanent headquarters. And Richard D. McCrossen, the newly appointed head of the operation, expects to close on the purchase of a home in nearby Brandon next month. And even a year later, on August 16th, 1981, the New York Times couldn't resist another poke, while noting New York's belated but unsuccessful attempt to salvage the situation. Alarmed, New York followed suit by changing its usury law. But Citibank had promised South Dakota, and that promise it did keep. Did this herald a sweep of business to South Dakota? Well, First Bank System of Minneapolis did warm up to South Dakota, but no one else has. That little taunt was baseless even at the time, because there were several substantial operations that had come or were in serious negotiations to come to South Dakota. Later developments proved the Times jab to be even further off the mark. I must say a word about Citibank, South Dakota's first president, Richard McCrossen. After the Citibank Bill passed, Charlie Long told McCrossen, "Dick, you're going to love South Dakota." I've always wondered if that was a prediction or an order. But in any event, McCrossen got South Dakota off to a great start as he led the organization's move here and built the operation into the most profitable part of Citibank's business. He was a strong and disciplined leader, and he never left any doubt among his troops that he had high expectations of them, which I might add they were very reluctant to disappoint. But he was also such a close friend of T.M. Reardon, and as a result of that, I had the opportunity to get to know him on a personal level as a politically astute businessman, an engaging and charming New Yorker, and someone who was determined to make Citibank work for South Dakota as well as South Dakota did for Citibank. It was evident from the community involvement of the entire Citibank South Dakota executive team that this was a commitment that they all shared, and it became a permanent part of the corporate culture of the Sioux Falls Bank. Walter Wriston, Citibank's chairman, and John Reed, his successor, could not have been more pleased with how well things were turning out in South Dakota. According to Zweig, New Yorkers had warned Wriston that South Dakotans would be undependable workers, but Citibank found the opposite to be true. One executive observed that South Dakotans worked harder than New Yorkers, which allowed the Sioux Falls Bank to perform the same work with fewer employees. Wriston was also impressed that a letter could make it from Long Island to Sioux Falls a half day faster than a letter from Long Island to Manhattan. And by the way, that initial promise of 300 to 500 jobs, well, Citibank significantly over-delivered. By the time its campus was completed, it employed over 2,000 people, and today it employs approximately 2,300 in Sioux Falls. Subsequent to Citibank's initial move to South Dakota, there have been several key banking developments in South Dakota. In 2004, Wells Fargo designated Sioux Falls as its main office. Its CEO at the time, Dick Kovacevic, had been an executive with Citibank and was personally familiar with the quality of the experience that Citibank had in South Dakota. After 25 years, our good reputation was paying new dividends. Then, in 2008, Wells Fargo acquired Wachovia Bank. Wells Fargo consolidated the two banks in 2010, which made it a $1.2 trillion bank with its main office in Sioux Falls. Finally, while under the leadership of then CEO Vikram Pandit in 2011, Citibank South Dakota merged with Citibank NA, and Citibank NA designated Sioux Falls as its main office. It too was a $1.2 trillion bank, with two of the four largest financial institutions in the United States designating Sioux Falls as their main office. South Dakota gained its #1 ranking in bank assets. Look at the table. As of last June, South Dakota had $2.8 trillion in banking assets, almost 20% of the $14.5 trillion national total. Being the leader in banking assets gives us more than simple bragging rights. It is the key factor in South Dakota's unclaimed property receipts, which annually generate tens of millions of dollars for South Dakota government. We cannot take our #1 ranking for granted. This slide will illustrate why. Look at what has happened to banking assets over the last 10 years for 6 states: Delaware, Nevada, New York, North Carolina, Ohio, and South Dakota. Ohio is right behind us. That's where J.P. Morgan, the nation's largest bank, has its charter. North Carolina is the home of Bank of America's charter. Until 2010, that state also had Wachovia's charter and its $600 billion in assets, but those assets became part of our total when Wachovia merged with Wells Fargo. Perhaps the most important line to look at is Nevada's. At the beginning of the 10-year period, Nevada was near the bottom. It quickly shot up to 3rd place when HSBC and Citibank moved their charters to that state. Today, with just a few years later, Nevada is back where it started. The point is, a state's banking assets can quickly change because national banks can move their charters without much more than a filing with the comptroller of the currency, the regulator of national banks. So while South Dakota has been fortunate to make its way to the top during the course of the last 35 years, there are no guarantees it will always be that way. The journey of Citibank to South Dakota is more than just an interesting story. It's an extraordinary part of our state's history. Yet there are also several important lessons in it, 2 of which I believe deserve special mention. First is that vision and courage combined with action, whether in our personal lives, business, or in government, can have significant consequences. Now, on your way home tonight, and as you are out and about this week, look around and ask yourself this in sort of a back to the future reflection: how different would Sioux Falls be today if in that moment on Valentine's Day 1980, Governor Janklow had taken the easy road and said to Charlie Long, "What you've told me, Charlie, is very interesting, but with only 2 legislative days left, there's no way I can get this done." Second, as observed by Friedrich Hayek, even our best plans, meticulously designed and flawlessly executed, will, sometimes to our disappointment, sometimes to our delight, produce results we never intend or anticipate, or perhaps even have the capacity to imagine. And while it was never part of any grand plan, there can be no doubt that the success of the Citibank experience has surpassed even our wildest dreams. It has also brought us closer to the larger world and given us a new sense of the potential of our community and an abiding belief in the unbounded possibilities of the future. Thank you for being here tonight.
Session. So if you have any questions, well, feel free to ask. Go ahead.
For Doug, and Doug, you may not, maybe an unfair question for you, but one of your last slides was showing bank assets, and that Ohio is a close second to us, and Nevada has dropped off completely. What is your assessment now about our relationship, the relationship between South Dakota and Citibank, And how secure is that charter in our state, the current employment level, and the trillions of dollars in assets that Citibank domiciles in our state? How secure is that?
Well, you're right. That is an unfair question. I would only say this. South Dakota has a 35-year history, a track record of supporting the industry, providing the kind of an environment that financial institutions like. It's dependable. We have reasonable regulation, reasonable tax rates. There are only so many things we can do. So that's our part. And keeping the right environment for it is the critical thing. But there are things beyond our control. Things happen that we just simply have no control over. So I really can't give you an answer to that. I hope it's a good, solid relationship. I think the experience that Citibank has had here for 35 years has been very good. Our legislature has consistently over that time period, and our governors have consistently over that time period seen this as a real partnership, something that's done great things and benefited our state in so many ways. And so it's my hope that we continue to realize that. And frankly, we don't have a strong hand. It's very competitive out there. There are many states that would love to have these charters that we are so fortunate to have. And we just have to remember that. But there's only so much we can control.
This is fascinating, and the positives are very evident. I hope you write a book and we can keep the details of that. I thought it was not entertaining, but it's very important for us to hear it. You know that I would probably point out a negative or two, but in particular with the unlimited interest rate, what would you say to the fact that Janklow later in the same video said, wasn't interested in high interest? He said 20%, but certainly not 400. He was interested in 400 jobs, not those high interest rates. But it's also opened the door to subprime lending, and credit cards, and that kind of thing, which we would say has a negative side for our society as well. What do you say to that kind of concern today?
Well, I think in the very same video, Governor Janklow made no apologies for doing what he did. The fact of the matter is, times are very different today than they were 30 years ago. We have a totally deregulated banking industry when it comes to the money cost side of it. And the fact is, subprime lending, and in fact, no usury limits. We're not the only state that doesn't have a usury limit. So we're not going to stop this from happening. I don't know if that helps answer your question, but I mean, I would be the first to agree. I wouldn't want to pay the high interest rates, and I guess for the college students here, if you get, you probably all have credit cards, I suppose, at this point. But if you do, get in the habit of paying them in full every month. Don't let your balances run. It's just an expensive way to borrow money. There are better ways, and best thing is to just find ways to pay it off every month or not spend the money. And that's the kind of habit that you want to develop. But I think it's in today's world, credit is so easy. And what South Dakota does or doesn't do really isn't going to change that.